On the night of the 29th of November 2012, in the same California county, two men ended up flat on their backs about 10 miles apart. One of them was 66 years old. He was born in a small town in Punjab, got into IIT Delhi, and then got on a plane to America in 1970 and built success. That night, he was lying on the floor of his own 7,000 square foot mansion in one of the safest towns in the United States with tape across his mouth. The other man was 26. He was homeless. He had been homeless most of his life. That night, he was lying on the pavement outside a corner shop in downtown San Jose with enough alcohol in his blood to stop a person breathing. The two of them had allegedly never met. Neither knew the other existed. But by morning, one of them was dead and the other was going to be charged with killing him. This is the story of those two men and that one murder. This is the story of Raveesh Kumra. Hi everyone, welcome to the Desi Crime Podcast, a show where we dive deep into some of the craziest cases from around South Asia. I'm your host Aishwarya.
I'm Aryan.
And the case that I have for you today is kind of a reversal on all of those really cool DNA technology cases that we've brought to you so far.
Aishwarya, I've been trying to get you to use different kinds of technology for a few months now. Play around with it.
Not DNA technology.
No, I God hope that's not the technology you have to use.
Technology nonetheless.
I have. And I do this with my friends also, right? But that's because my friends do it with me. And I
really
just want to
annoying.
read out an example to you of what's happening in the boys group chat that I have with my
Sure.
friends. One of them types, "All I want to do is whisper flow." Lucas responds, who's a friend of mine, "I know." The other says, "It's so accurate, crazy right." In another screenshot, I've written, "Thanks for whisper, amazing tool." And my friends respond, "Life-changing."
That's
And
crazy.
These are chats, you can put them up here. These are all chats from, I think, 3 months ago. Before Whisperflow ever became a sponsor of the podcast. And I've been
Yeah.
badgering you
I've been
to
hearing
use it.
about it for so long.
So I've been using this app for so long. So I reached out to their team and I said, guys, you have to sponsor me because I've been using this voice to dictation app
and shoving it down everyone else's throat.
to write all the Desi crime scripts because, dude, our scripts are what, 5,000, 7,000 words long.
Yeah.
We keep typing away all day long. Now I can just narrate into my Mac. I click a button, I narrate into my Mac, and the words just appear. Exactly
Right.
what I said. Even if I've said something like, no, actually, no, don't do that. It wouldn't type, don't do that. It'll
Oh, it
just
knows.
figure out, oh, Aryan obviously doesn't want that.
That's crazy.
Aishwarya, I shift from English to Hindi. It'll get all of that right. It'll get my English perfectly down.
That's
In
incredible.
the last 6 months of me using it, I have narrated about 120,000 words to it, which according to Whisperflow is I've narrated an entire novel.
What a fanboy right here.
I've narrated an entire novel.
That's insane.
So my
Talks too much
my-
is all I'm gathering from this.
No, types too less is what you should be hearing. So my typing speed is like 5 times faster now. It's a product I absolutely love using. And
Sure.
guys, you can get it for free for the first 2 months. You can get the pro plan of Whisper for free in the special Desi Crime link that is in the description. Just try it. If you think it's a sponsor,
Yeah.
paid, this, that, just try it for free. If it doesn't change things for you, then say Aryan or stop using that app. It's become one of my favorite apps of the last year.
So please go try it out, you guys, because yesterday in a car with Aryan, I was trying to tell him that Apple kind of
This
has
is
the
all
same
true.
feature
This is all true.
where you can dictate messages, or in your notes app, you can dictate in an iPhone. And I got a 30-minute lecture on why absolutely it is not the same thing.
Unrelated to the sponsor, because I don't get
Completely
paid
unrelated.
to berate Aishwarya.
No, unrelated. I got a 30-minute lecture on why Whisperflow is absolutely different and a bajillion times better. So to get him to stop talking about this, please go try try it out. All the links are there.
Okay, with that, let's get on with the case for today.
Let's do it. But before we get on with the episode, we need to let you all know that you can now get early access to all Desi Crime episodes on Amazon Music. To get your fix a whole 3 days before anyone else, go download the Amazon Music app today. On the 26th of December 2012, the day after Christmas, in a windowless interview room inside the Santa Clara County Jail in San Jose, California, a 26-year-old man named Lucas Anderson sat down across a table from 2 detectives he had never met. He was already in that jail. He had been picked up a few days earlier for violating the terms of his probation, which for Lucas Anderson was an almost routine event, the way a parking ticket is routine for the rest of us. He was homeless and had been homeless for most of his life. He spent his days on the pavements of downtown San Jose, asking strangers for change outside convenience stores, and then drinking. Drinking not socially, not recreationally, but the kind of drinking that erases entire days from a person's memory and does not give them back. So when a guard came to get him that morning and told him 2 detectives wanted a word, he had no particular reason to think it was about anything more than a probation violation. The 2 men waiting for him were Corporal Erin Lunsford and Sergeant Mike D'Antonio, and they had not driven over from San Jose. They had come all the way from Los Gatos, Monte Sereno Police Department, a 38-officer agency that polices 2 of the sleepiest, wealthiest, and most aggressively uneventful towns in the entire Bay Area.
So how far is where he got arrested from where the police department was from?
So far, but not super far. It's around 13 miles, which is what, like 25 kilometers,
But
I
they're
think?
still separate jurisdictions.
Separate jurisdictions, correct. Now, the area these police officers were from, Los Gatos, averaged 1 homicide every 3 or 4 years. The other area they came from, Monte Sereno, which is essentially a bedroom community attached to a bedroom community, had not had one in roughly 20 years. The 2 officers had a tape recorder running. Officer Lunsford started by laying photographs on the table. One of a man who was now dead. Another of a woman, the dead man's wife, who almost died. "Does this guy look familiar to you? What about this lady?" Officer Lunsford asked. "I don't know, man," Lucas Anderson said. So Lunsford laid down a 3rd photograph. This one was of Lucas's mother. "All right, what about this lady here? You don't know who she is?" Lucas didn't answer. He just looked at him. And then Lunsford put down the piece of paper that he had been holding back. It was a letter from the state of California. It was a notification from a database match. It said that a DNA profile recovered from a homicide scene in Monte Sereno had been run through the state's criminal offender index, and it came back to one name. This man sitting in front of them, Lucas Anderson. The profile had been recovered from underneath a dead man's fingernails. "This starting to ring some bells," Lunsford said. Then D'Antonio tried the softer route. "My guess," he said, "is that you didn't think anybody was going to be home. My guess is it went a lot further than you ever meant it to." "I don't know what you're talking about," Lucas said. "You do," said Lunsford. "You won't look at their pictures. The only picture you looked at good was your mom." And then D'Antonio said the sentence that this entire episode is built around. He said he didn't have a crystal ball. He said only Lucas knew what the truth was. But, he said, "I have never seen a DNA hit be wrong." Now, here's the thing about that room and about that conversation and about the 4 months that followed it. Lucas Anderson could not tell them where he had been that night. Not because he was hiding it, because he genuinely did not know. Because his drinking had reached the stage where days simply detached themselves from him and floated off, and he had years of practice waking up in places with no idea how he got there. He had been hit by a truck once, drunk, stepping off a curb, and his memory had never worked properly since. So when the Santa Clara County Public Defender's Office assigned him a lawyer, a woman named Kelly Cullick, and she sat down with him in that same jail and explained that the district attorney was charging him with first-degree murder with special circumstances, and that special circumstances in California in 2012 meant the state could ask to kill him, Lucas Anderson said something to her that no defense lawyer ever wants to hear. He said, "I drink a lot. Sometimes I black out. Maybe I did do it." That's when she told him to stop talking immediately, because if she was going to keep him off death row, he couldn't go around saying things like that. But privately, sitting there with the state's paperwork in front of her, she agreed with the prosecution about one thing. It looked really, really bad for him. But to understand why the death of the man in that photograph had brought 2 detectives from a town with no murders all the way to a jail cell in San Jose the day after Christmas, talking to an already imprisoned inmate who claimed to remember nothing, we have to go back 38 years and about 7,500 miles to a town in Punjab. Raveesh Kumra was born on the 20th of September 1946 in Kartarpur in Punjab in the last year of undivided India. He was born, in other words, into the 11 months before partition, into a Punjab that was about to be cut in half, in a family that would watch that happen. He was a baby when it did, and he would go on to have no memory of it. But the world he grew up in was the world it left behind. Despite that world, though, and despite the turmoil of it, he was clever. Not family anecdote clever, but measurably, competitively clever. He got into the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi and took a degree in chemical engineering, which in India of the 1960s was about as far as academic ambition could take you. And then in 1970, at 24 years old, he did what a very specific generation of Indian engineers did in that decade. He got on a plane to the United States. And when he arrived there, he didn't go into chemical engineering. He went into wireless engineering. He arrived in America in 1970, which is roughly a decade and a half before anybody in the country owned a mobile phone. He settled in the Bay Area and he became one of the very first Indian-born entrepreneurs in the American wireless industry. A man placing bets on cellular telephone technology while it was still, to most people, a novelty from a science fiction film. He started companies, Western Cellular Management, SLO Cellular. There were San Francisco and South Bay and Napa entities registered in his name, chasing the interactive video and data spectrum licenses the American federal regulators were auctioning off in the mid-90s. He ran an investment vehicle called Tesla Capital. This is years before Elon Musk's company existed, and they're entirely unrelated. Both of them just really liked Nikola Tesla. And by the 1990s, he had become what his family, in his obituary, called one of the quietest angel investors in Silicon Valley. But the thing is, Ravi or Raveesh Kumra was not, by any account, a quiet man. He was a talker, he was an arguer. He loved philosophy and he loved politics and he loved being disagreed with. And he was famous, genuinely famous among everybody who knew him for sending enormous emails at 2 o'clock in the morning. 2,000 words on religion, on mathematics, on music, to whoever he had been thinking about that day. He had perfect pitch, and he would get so carried away by a song he liked that he would sit down at a keyboard and play it at you.
He sounds like Tim Ferriss before Tim Ferriss was a thing. Like, this dude could have been one of those podcaster bros.
Absolutely,
that
give him
has
a mic.
Weekly newsletter that comes. Yeah, that's what he sounds like. He's
100%.
writing blog posts before blog posts are a thing.
Exactly. And he entertained constantly all the many, many friends he had on multiple continents. He was, his own family said, a man who never turned down a request for help. Then, in 1974, he left all of that behind for a while and went back to India to get married to a woman named Harinder from Ludhiana. Everybody called her Rani, and the two went on to have 2 daughters, Reena and Anisha. And by the mid-90s, the Kumras were living in a 7,000 square foot house on Vithi Road in Monte Sereno, a town so small and so expensive that describing it as a suburb of Silicon Valley undersells it. It's the place people move to when they've already succeeded somewhere else. And then, in 1995, he did what I think is the coolest thing you can do with money. He bought a winery. Not just any winery. He paid $6 million for the Mountain Winery in Saratoga, the estate built more than a century earlier by Paul Mason, the French-born pioneer who's more or less responsible for the modern California wine industry. It came with a hillside amphitheater. It's one of the most famous concert venues in Northern California. If you've ever seen a photograph of an outdoor swimming gig in Santa Cruz Mountains with the whole valley glittering below the stage, there's a decent chance you were looking at Raveesh Kumra's property. He owned it for about 4 years, but then he sold it in 1999, reportedly after falling out badly with his own staff. And this is where the sunlit version of Raveesh Kumra's life starts developing shadows. And I want to be careful and precise here, because a lot of what came out about this man came out after his death, in courtrooms, from people with their own reasons to say it. Here is what is on the record and undisputed though. In 1998, while he still owned the winery, Ravi Kumra was arrested. A woman who worked for him at the Mountain Winery accused him of leaving her threatening voicemail messages. The charges he initially faced were serious: assault and battery, making annoying and threatening phone calls, and making criminal threats. It resolved the way these things often resolve, with him pleading no contest to 2 counts of disturbing the peace, and was given 3 years of probation, with one of the conditions of the probation being staying away from drugs and alcohol. Here is what is on the record after that about his personal life. In 2006, after more than 30 years of marriage, Ravi and Rani Kumra filed for divorce, which was then finalized in 2010. But then in 2011, he moved back into the house with her. They were divorced, but they lived together. They slept in separate bedrooms on separate floors of a 7,000 square foot house on Vithi Road, but they ate dinner together. By every account, they were, in whatever complicated way, still each other's people. She was still in his will. She was still in the family photographs. When she talks about him even now, she still talks about her husband. And running underneath all of this, for well over a decade, was the other life. The life with a lot of sex and a lot of women. Because as it turns out, Ravi Kumra paid for sex a lot. He had done so for years. He hired sex workers to come to the house on Vithi Road and to hotels around the South Bay. And this was not a discreet, occasional, deeply buried thing. There were multiple women. Some of them he saw for years. He took them on holidays, Las Vegas, Florida. He bought them cars. According to testimony that came later, he once handed 3 of them a blank check and let them buy 3 expensive cars in a single day. It's important to state here that almost everything I said just now comes from the sworn testimony of a woman who was, at the time she gave that testimony, negotiating her way out of a murder charge. So I'm going to tell you who she is in a little bit, but take this with whatever grains of salt you want. But what is independently established is this. The people who investigated Ravi Kumra's death heard about the sex workers from multiple people who knew him within days, without having to dig for it. One of the investigators actually knew him already. Erin Lunsford, the detective from the beginning of this case, who put the photographs on the table, had been to the Kumra house a couple of times over the years on what he called family calls, the kind that never amounted to anything, just people arguing. And he knew Ravi from a dive bar in town called Gogan's Last Call, where Lunsford turned up in uniform and Ravi turned up as a regular. Lunsford's description of him is one of my favorite lines in the entire reporting of this case. He said Ravi Kumra was an affable extrovert who was always buying rounds. He called him the unofficial mayor of that part of town. So this was a brilliant, gregarious, generous, difficult, secretive, 66-year-old immigrant success story, living with his ex-wife in a mansion in a town where nothing happens. Which brings us to the last ordinary evening of his life. On the night of the 29th of November 2012, Rani Kumra cooked Indian vegetarian food while Ravi was in his home office working the way he always was. She talked him into coming out to the kitchen just long enough to eat dinner with her, where they both then sat, chatted, and ate their meals. Once dinner wrapped up, she washed the dishes, then went up to her bedroom, got into bed, and turned off the lights. Years later, she would say she couldn't remember whether she had locked her bedroom door that night, the way she usually did. Now, the Kumras had a security alarm system installed in the house, but it was not switched on. Not tonight, not ever. It was not switched on because they didn't think they needed it, because they considered Monte Sereno an extremely safe place to live. Ravi, in fact, often just left the front door open too. That's why, sometime around midnight, someone entered the home. More than one person, without needing to force an entry or break a window or jemmy a lock or disable an alarm. The home was just open. They found Ravi first. He was downstairs in the living room, awake, watching CNN, when they ambushed him, put him on the ground, tied him up, and then blindfolded and gagged him. And here's the detail I can't stop thinking about. When they gagged him and then taped his mouth, the tape they used had a mustache print on it. A novelty pattern, like cartoon mustaches, the kind of thing you buy for a birthday party. Then they went upstairs and found Rani asleep in her bedroom. They hit her on her face, dragged her out of bed, brought her downstairs and bound her hands with tape and put her on the floor next to her ex-husband. One of them told her to be quiet if she wanted to live. She was 63 years old that night. She was wearing gold bracelets, 22-carat Indian gold, the kind that go on for a wedding and then never really come off again, that they pulled off of her wrists. And then, while the two of them lay tied up and blindfolded on the floor of their own kitchen, the men went through the house. They emptied dressers, they dumped files out of drawers, they took cash and jewelry and a collection of rare coins, something in the region of $30,000 worth of property in total. At some point, somebody dropped a mobile phone into a toilet and peed on it. At some point, somebody opened the refrigerator and left it open. And then they all left. The house they left behind was completely silent except for one sound, that refrigerator beeping every 10 seconds, patiently announcing that its doors were still open. Rani Kumra was still blindfolded and still bound, but she was alive, and she could hear that nobody was moving anymore. Not even Ravi. Half relieved that the intruders were out of the house and half panicked that her ex-husband wasn't responding anymore, she got herself up off the floor. And blind in her own kitchen in a house that had been torn apart, she felt her way along the counters until she found the phone. At 1:30 in the morning, she got through to emergency services and told them that intruders had been in her home and that her husband was lying on the floor. At 2:15 that morning, in San Jose, a police radio dispatcher rang Corporal Erin Lunsford's phone. It rang 5 times before he picked it up. "Are you awake?" she asked him. "Yeah," said Lunsford, who definitely wasn't awake. She asked whether he was back on full duty yet or still on light duty. He had been off crutches for a fortnight, but it was 2:15 in the morning and it was absolutely hammering down rain outside, and so he assumed that this dispatcher was going to send him out to stand next to a fallen tree. So he said, "Light duty." "Oh, never mind," she said. And that tiny, ordinary, almost comic beat is the moment Erin Lunsford asked what she was actually calling about. And she tells him they've had a home invasion that has turned into a 187, which is the section of the California Penal Code that covers murder, and which is what American police say when they don't want to say the word. He got dressed and drove out through the rain. He found police cars clustered around a brick and iron gate, and an ambulance in the driveway with its bright lights. And behind all of it, the Kumra mansion lit up. His boss told him to take the lead on the investigation. So the on-scene supervisor walked him through the house, and Lunsford saw what I've just described to you. The empty dressers, the dumped files, the phone in the toilet, the beeping fridge. And then he saw Ravi Kumra on the floor near the kitchen, heavy-set and disheveled, with the blindfold still over his eyes, unresponsive and dead. An investigator from the county coroner's office arrived and took Ravi's body to the morgue, and Lunsford followed her there and stood through the autopsy. A doctor undressed him, and then, as is standard procedure in any homicide, the doctor scraped underneath Raveesh Kumra's fingernails and clipped them and bagged what came out. The cause of death, when the coroner ruled on it, was asphyxiation. He had suffocated on the gag. He had been tied and blindfolded and left on the side of a kitchen with novelty mustache tape over his mouth, and he had not been able to breathe through it, and nobody in that house was in any position to help. Rani, on the other hand, was taken to the hospital, and thankfully her injuries were not life-threatening. She was even able to give a description of one of the men, a slim young man, white or Latino, in his early 20s, around 6 feet, with dark hair and dark eyes, and the police put out a sketch based on it within days.
Ashura, so we know he died of asphyxiation, but are there any ligature marks, like any signs of strangling him?
There's nothing. There is just the fact that he was choked this way and left with tape on his mouth, and he couldn't breathe through it.
And couldn't breathe through his nose either?
Yeah, just the amount of tape they had applied, the way that they had gagged his mouth, he couldn't breathe.
In Highway Jest, which is a great book written by one of my favorite American authors, there's this scene where this Canadian individual, similar rich guy in a burglary, his mouth is taped, and still he somehow dies the next day, and that's because it was allergy season and he couldn't breathe through his nose.
Oh,
And
that's
so
insane.
I was just wondering, because usually somebody doesn't tape your nose
Right,
as well.
right.
Because if that's the case, you are going to be dead within the next 5 minutes.
There are some reports, not an allergy, but some reports that do state that he had underlying health conditions. He was of a significant age. And so just that combination of choking his mouth that much, it being taped, and possibly some of the tape being on his nose.
Possibly like a mouth breather that, over
Correct.
a
Multiple
prolonged
things could have
duration
gone
of
wrong.
8 hours, your body doesn't get enough oxygen from your nose, and so that can also lead to asphyxiation.
Now, it's worth saying that nobody has ever suggested that the men who did this walked into that house intending to kill anyone. But under California law, it makes no difference at all. If someone dies during the commission of a robbery, that is first-degree murder, full stop. But it matters to how you picture that night. This was a robbery that went wrong in the most banal and horrifying way imaginable. They put tape on his mouth so he would stay quiet, and then they went shopping in his house for an hour, and by the time they left, he had been dead for some part of it. While Lunsford was at the autopsy, a team of investigators in gloves was going through the mansion. They were doing what crime scene teams have done since a French scientist called Edmond Locard laid down the founding principles of forensics more than a century ago. That a person who commits a crime brings something to the scene and leaves with something from it. Fingerprints, footprints, hairs, fiber. But this was also 2012, and so they were also thinking very deliberately about surfaces, about every single thing in that house that a stranger's hand might have rested on. They filled more than 100 evidence containers. And in the kitchen sink, they found something that told them the men who had done this had at least some idea of what they were up against. A pile of latex gloves. Wet, soapy, sitting in the basin. Somebody on their way out of a house where they had just killed a man had stopped at the sink and tried to wash their gloves. The gloves went to the crime lab along with everything else. The criminalist who worked the Kumra evidence was a woman named Tani Nelson Mehmet, and over the weeks after the murder, she ran dozens of tests on what had come out of that house. Most of them told her nothing she didn't already know. Most of the profiles that came back were consistent with Ravi or with Rani, which is exactly what you would expect from objects inside their own home. But in her first few batches, she hit something. A handful of unknown profiles, genetic material belonging to people who had no business being in that house at all. And critically, one of those profiles came off the washed latex gloves in the sink, which tells you something about how well washing your gloves in a hurry actually works. She ran the unknown profiles through California's state DNA database, the index that holds the genetic profiles of everybody in the state who's been arrested for or convicted of a felony. And she got 3 hits. All 3 from the Bay Area. On the mustache duct tape, a 22-year-old man from Oakland named D'Angelo Austin. On the latex gloves, a 21-year-old named Javier Garcia. And on the fingernail clippings taken from Ravi Kumra's body at the autopsy, a 26-year-old named Lucas Anderson. Now, 2 of those 3 names started making sense almost immediately. Lunsford got a warrant for D'Angelo Austin and Javier Garcia's phone records, and the records showed that on the night of the homicide, both of their phones had pinged mobile towers near Monte Sereno. 2 young men from Oakland, an hour's drive north, with no business in a town like that, putting their phones in the local network at exactly the wrong time. Police records also showed that Austin belonged to a gang that had been linked to a string of home burglaries. But then there was the connection that made the whole thing click into place. D'Angelo Austin had an older sister. Her name was Katrina Fritz. She was 32 years old and a sex worker who had been involved with Ravi Kumra for 12 years. She had been going to that house since 1999, and so she knew the layout, she knew the habits, she knew about the alarm that never got switched on and the door he left open. In fact, police found her own phone backed up on Ravi's computer. So by the turn of the year, Aaron Lunsford had a coherent story for 2 of his 3 DNA hits. A robbery crew from Oakland, set up by a woman on the inside who had spent over a decade in and out of that house. But the third name did not fit anywhere. Lucas Anderson had no gang affiliation. There were no phone records putting him anywhere near Monte Sereno. He had no connection to Katrina Fritz. He had no connection to Ravi Kumra. He was a homeless man who lived on the streets of downtown San Jose, roughly 10 miles and an entire universe away from Withy Road. But there was one line on his criminal record that caught Lunsford's eye, and I want you to notice how much weight it ends up carrying. Felony residential burglary. So Lunsford went looking for a connection between Lucas and the other 2 men. And he found one. A year earlier, Lucas had been held in the same jail as a man named Sean Hampton, who happened to be a friend of D'Angelo Austin's. Hampton was on parole and wearing an ankle monitor, and the ankle monitor data showed that 2 days before the Kumra robbery, Hampton had driven to San Jose and made a couple of stops in the downtown area, right in the few blocks where Lucas Anderson spent his days. And so the picture assembled itself, the way pictures do. Austin is planning a break-in on a big house in a town he doesn't know. He wants somebody local. He wants somebody with burglary experience. So he asks around. His friend Hampton says, actually, I know a guy from lockup, Lucas Anderson. So Hampton drives down 2 days before the job to make contact. The story fits. Every piece of it fits. And on top of it sits the single most persuasive category of evidence that exists in a modern courtroom. Lucas's DNA was underneath the victim's fingernails, which is precisely where you would expect to find it if the victim had struggled against him while being tied up. That is the case the inspectors took to the district attorney. And on the 26th of December 2012, 3.5 weeks after Ravi Kumra died, 2 detectives sat down across a table from Lucas Anderson in the Santa Clara County Jail and told him they had never seen a DNA hit be wrong.
Aishwarya, this is not just a case where the detectives are saying we've never seen a DNA hit be wrong.
There's more.
In this case itself, they've seen the DNA hit being what led them to the first 2 obvious perpetrators.
And there is a connection between the first 2 obvious perpetrators and the third DNA hit. The inspectors are not wrong.
And then the DNA wasn't found on the gloves. Like, I can come up with, even to explain DNA randomly in the house, I would have to make, stretches of my imagination. But DNA under the fingernails is a classic example of struggle against an individual.
Absolutely, which is what we all think until I take you deeper and deeper into this case and give you some science. It's insane. I am mind blown at what I've learned.
He was giving the homeless guy money and he grabbed his hand.
No.
I don't blame the This
I
is
don't
the
blame the
first time
detectives.
you're leading me towards a maybe botched up investigation where I'm like, I don't blame the detectives.
It's not their fault. It's not their fault. Now, Lucas Anderson was charged with first-degree murder with the special circumstances of murder committed during a robbery. In California, that's the charge that opens the door to the death penalty. But before we get to that, let me tell you who they had actually charged. Lucas Anderson was born in 1986. He spent a great deal of his childhood homeless. Not adult homeless, not down on his luck homeless, but a child without a fixed address. In early adulthood, he was diagnosed with a mental health disorder and with diabetes. And somewhere along the way, he developed the drinking problem that would define the rest of his life. And then came the truck. He was drunk, he stepped off a curb, and he walked directly into the path of a moving vehicle. He survived it, but his memory never properly worked again. He lost track of days, sometimes several in a row. And I want to be careful not to hand you a portrait of absolute misery, because that's not who people describe him to be. They describe a man who made friends easily, who had a sly, deadpan sense of humor, who had, as one reporter put it, dimples that came on like headlights. His friends on the street looked out for him. So did a number of shopkeepers in downtown San Jose who knew him by name and kept an eye on him. When his public defender and her investigator went around and spoke to those people, they all said a version of the same thing. Lucas is a drunk. He may be a terrible drunk, but Lucas isn't a killer. But then there is his criminal record, which is the thing that actually put him in the state's DNA database in the first place. It is, almost in its entirety, a record of poverty. Drunk in public, riding a bicycle under the influence, probation violations for the drunk in public, the whole miserable circular apparatus that American cities use to process people who have nowhere to sleep.
I didn't know you could get a DUI for being on a bicycle.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I also heard about it for the first time while researching, but I think that makes
unless you are driving a bicycle on a highway, I get it. But if you're in a park and a little tipsy,
you could hit a person and push them off into traffic. Like, so much can go wrong.
I think the ABV qualification for bicycle needs to be higher than driving a car. Like, because you can go out with your boys, get a Lime bike, a little tipsy. I'm not saying I've done it in California.
It's totally not done.
Totally not me.
Now, all of this sounds pretty mellow, except for that one felony, the residential burglary. Here is what that burglary was. Lucas Anderson, extremely drunk, broke the front window of a house and tried to climb through it. The horrified person who lived there pushed him back out of their own window using blankets. Police found him a few minutes later, standing on the pavement outside, dazed and bleeding. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was taken. There is no indication he had any idea where he was. But he was charged with felony residential burglary and pleaded no contest. And because a felony conviction in California means the state takes your DNA and keeps it forever, that plea is the reason this genetic profile was sitting in a database waiting to be matched.
So far, I was thinking that the burglary that he did was in scale and in manner similar to the one that got Raveesh Kumra killed. This is analogous to you having shoplifted as a child, but the punishment you got for, or the legal definition of the shoplift was hypothetically burglary.
Correct.
And then later a proper burglary happened and it
where
said, listen, you have done that before. But you've done that in the most, it's apples to oranges.
100% agreed. He was so drunk at that first burglary, all the other person did was literally threw blankets at him and he fell off the window.
Yeah.
And injured himself. So,
but again, I don't blame the cops.
I still don't blame the cops. I get why they would see residential burglary and another burglary where someone's dead.
And DNA evidence.
And a connection with two other perpetrators and go, this is, of course, our guy.
At this point, have the two guys said whether they know of this third guy?
There hasn't been a conversation to that effect. So this is the man, a homeless alcoholic with a head injury, a felony conviction for a maybe burglary, and no memory whatsoever of the night Raveesh Kumra was killed. He could not tell his lawyer where he was. He could not name a single person who could tell her either. He could not rule himself out, and his DNA was under a murdered man's fingernails. Kelly Cullick, his lawyer, had been doing this job long enough to know what she was looking at. She had a client facing execution, a client who had opened their first conversation by wondering aloud whether he'd done it, and a piece of evidence that no jury in Santa Clara County was going to argue with. So she started preparing for the only fight she thought she had. Now, when you defend somebody in a capital case, you prepare two cases at once. The first one is the case about whether your client did it. The second one is the case about why the state should not kill him if he did. And that second one is built almost entirely out of a person's history. Their childhood, their trauma, their illnesses, their diagnoses. You gather every scrap of documentation about the worst thing that has ever happened to your client, and you put it in front of 12 people, and you ask them to see a human being. So Kelly Cullick sent her investigator out to pull everything, every medical record, every mental health record, every hospitalization in Lucas Anderson's life. And Lucas Anderson had a lot of hospitalizations because a man drinking the way he drank ends up in a county emergency room on a fairly regular basis.
Plus he has diabetes. So alcohol is just sugar. I mean,
Absolutely.
That's messing with his health even more.
Correct. And so, of course, that record comes back as a stack. The investigator did not put that stack in the post. The investigator walked into Cullick's office, put it on her desk, and told her to look at it. Look at it now. Because the most recent record in that pile was this. On the night of the 29th of November 2012, Lucas Anderson had been brought by ambulance to Santa Clara Valley Medical Center in San Jose. On arrival, he was assessed as inebriated to the point of near unconsciousness. His blood alcohol level was 0.40, 5 times the legal driving limit, a level at which a great many people just stop breathing.
That can be the level of DUI for bicycles.
Oh my, no, thank you. That's insane.
Okay.
Put in plain terms, he had drunk the equivalent of about 21 beers. He was admitted at 10:45 p.m. and spent the night in a hospital bed detoxing under medical supervision. He was discharged the following morning. Raveesh Kumra had told the police that the men who came into her house were there somewhere between 11:30 p.m. and 1:30 a.m. of that very night. Cullick looked up at her investigator. Her investigator was already looking at her. And what she felt, she said later, was not triumph. It was fear. Because a partial alibi is a thing defense lawyers live with all the time. A girlfriend who says he was home, a friend who thinks it might be that night. Those are arguments. This, what she had in front of her, was not an argument. This was a hospital admission signed by medical staff. Her exact words about it, years later, were that knowing you have a factually innocent client sitting in a cell facing the death penalty is terrifying, because now you can't afford to make a single mistake. So before she went anywhere near the district attorney, she and her investigator went and destroyed every hole they thought the prosecution might try to poke in it. Was the date wrong? Had somebody used his ID? Was there a second Lucas Anderson in San Jose? They reconstructed his entire evening, hour by hour, using a paper trail that a man who could not remember the day himself had left behind without knowing it. And here is that timeline. At 7:54 that evening, a clerk at a 7-Eleven in downtown San Jose rang the authorities to complain that a man was panhandling outside the shop. That man was Lucas Anderson, but he wandered off before police arrived. He drifted 4 blocks east to a shop called SNS Market. The clerk there remembered him. He remembered that Lucas sat down outside at about 8:15, already drunk, and proceeded to get considerably drunker over the next couple of hours. Then, at some point that evening, Anderson wandered inside the shop and collapsed in an aisle. And that's when the clerk called for help. Police arrived first, then a San Jose Fire Department truck. And one of the fire department paramedics told Cullick something that says a lot about the life Lucas Anderson had been living. He had picked this man up drunk so many times over the years that he knew his date of birth by heart. Then 2 more paramedics arrived with an ambulance. They got him onto a stretcher and took him to the hospital, admitted at 10:45 that night. In bed all night, according to the doctor who treated him. There is no version of this where he gets up out of that bed, gets himself 10 miles across the county to Monte Sereno, takes part in a home invasion robbery, and gets back to that bed. He was, by the assessment of trained medical staff, barely conscious. At the exact moment Ravi Kumra was suffocating on a kitchen floor on Vithi Road, Lucas Anderson was lying in a hospital bed in San Jose with a nurse checking on him. So now Kalik rang the district attorney's office and asked for a meeting. And here is where this stops being a story about a wrongful arrest and starts being a story about something much stranger, and I think something much more important. Because that meeting did not end the case. Lucas Anderson did not walk out of jail that week. He did not walk out of jail that month. He stayed in a cell, charged with capital murder, for a considerable amount of time after everybody involved had seen those hospital records. But why? Why wasn't he released? Because the prosecution had a question that nobody could answer, and it was a completely reasonable question. If Lucas Anderson was unconscious in a hospital bed 10 miles away, then how the hell did his DNA get underneath a dead man's fingernails? That question had to have an answer, and until it had one, the district attorney's office was not letting go. So, the inspectors went looking. Their first theory was the obvious one: contamination in the crime lab. Somebody had mixed something up, or an instrument had carried material from one case to another. So they reviewed the Kumra evidence handling, but found no obvious errors. They checked whether Anderson's DNA had come through the lab in any other recent case that could have wandered into this one. It hadn't. And so they moved on to theory 2. Theory 2 was that at some point in the hours or days before the murder, Ravi Kumra and Lucas Anderson had physically crossed paths, that the two men had met or brushed against each other or shaken hands, and that Anderson's skin cells had ended up under Kumra's nails and simply stayed there. The deputy district attorney on the case, Kevin Smith, said publicly at one point that they were convinced the two men's paths had crossed somewhere in that 24, 48 or 72 hours before the crime. And look, as a hypothesis, it's not physically impossible. But sit with what it actually requires you to believe. A 66-year-old venture capitalist who lived behind an iron gate in Monte Sereno, and a homeless man who spent his days on a stretch of pavement in downtown San Jose, coming into meaningful physical contact within 72 hours of the murder, by coincidence, and nobody anywhere ever found a single witness or record of it. While that theory was being pursued, Lucas Anderson stayed where he was. In total, he spent close to 5 months in a cell for a murder committed while he was unconscious in a hospital bed. In the end, though, the person who worked it out was Officer Aaron Lunsford, which I find genuinely amazing, and I want to give him credit for it, because there is a version of this story where the detective who built the case just digs his heels in and defends it.
Or he digs his nails in.
Or he digs his nails in and defends it.
I would have never guessed Lunsford is the one. We have seen so many cases where the investigator has attached their ego to the story they have developed.
Correct.
The amount of, again, it's easy to say, oh, he's just doing his job. No, these jobs are being done by humans who have, if you have egos in your day-to-day 9 to 5, imagine
they don't disappear at work.
As an investigative detective, of course you do. You're trying to solve a case. We've seen time and time again cases that get the wrong solution because somebody refuses to look at new evidence.
And it's more complicated than ego too. There is so much politics
Also,
in any police department.
And if this man changed his mind about DNA evidence of all evidences, not circumstantial evidence, not a theory he came up with. This is intellectual humility that at its 100%. Most beautiful level, and hats off.
I agree. Detective Lunsford didn't dig his heels in. He didn't defend his case. He listened to Kelly Cullick's presentation, and then he went and retraced Lucas Anderson's day himself, independently, and reached his own conclusion, that he had put an innocent man in jail. He said that since then he felt sick to his stomach, but he had to keep reading the files to find out how Lucas's DNA got under Raveesh's nails. He was going back through Lucas Anderson's medical records, and he came to the section listing the ambulance crew who had collected him off the pavement outside SNS Market. 2 paramedics, 2 names. He had seen those names before. He pulled the Kumra file, and there they were. The same 2 paramedics who scraped Lucas Anderson off the ground in downtown San Jose at 10 o'clock that night had roughly 3 hours later driven out to a mansion on Vithi Road in Monte Sereno. They had walked into that house, they had knelt down on the kitchen floor next to a bound and blindfolded man and checked his vital signs. One of them was the person who declared Raveesh Kumra dead. That's it. That is the whole answer. Nobody has ever established the precise mechanism, and I want to be honest with you about that rather than tidy it up. The prosecution, the defense, and the police all agree on what happened in general terms. The paramedics carried Lucas Anderson's genetic material from one patient to another. The Santa Clara County defense attorney has suggested it may have been the pulse oximeter, the little clip that goes on a patient's fingertip to read their oxygen levels, clipped onto Anderson's finger first and then onto Kumra's. Kelly Kulik has suggested a uniform or some other piece of equipment. The ambulance company said their sanitation standards were high, that crews changed gloves and sanitized vehicles. Kevin Smith, the prosecutor, summed the whole thing up by saying, "It's a small world." So nobody really knows. It may never be known. What is not in dispute is that a man's DNA traveled about 10 miles from a pavement outside a corner shop to underneath the fingernails of a corpse without him going anywhere. So let's now talk about how that's even possible. Because when I first read this case, my honest reaction was this sounds made up. Until the late 90s, if you wanted a DNA profile out of a crime scene, you needed something visible. A speck of blood, semen, saliva, something wet, something that you could point at. All of that, though, changed in 1997 when an Australian forensic scientist called Ronald van Orschot published a paper that was 9 paragraphs long, entitled brilliantly, DNA Fingerprints from Fingerprints. What it showed was that you did not need fluid at all. You could pull a usable profile of the trace a person leaves behind simply by touching something. It changed forensic science globally more or less overnight. Investigators everywhere started swabbing doorknobs, slabs, steering wheels, knife handles, anything a perpetrator might have laid a hand on. But buried in that same 9-paragraph paper was an observation that almost nobody paid attention to at the time. Some of the DNA Van Orschot found was on objects the person had never touched. He called it secondary transfer, and in the decades since, his lab has been one of the very small number anywhere in the world that studies this phenomena seriously. What they have found is that once your DNA is out in the world, it doesn't necessarily stay where you left it. Here is the experiment he ran. Van Orschot's lab sat a group of volunteers around a table and gave them a jug of juice to share. That's it. That's the whole scenario. They sat there for 30 minutes, chatting and pouring drinks like human beings do. Then the researchers swabbed everything. Hands, chairs, the table, the jug, every glass. The volunteers never touched each other, not once. And yet, a third of them finished the experiment with somebody else's DNA on their palm. A third of the glasses carried the DNA of people who had never touched them or drunk from them. And then there was the genuinely unsettling thing they found. On about half the chairs and half the glasses and all over the participants' hands and the table, there was foreign DNA, profiles that did not match any of the people in the room. The volunteers had walked in carrying strangers, the person they'd kissed that morning, the stranger whose hand had been on the same bus rail, the barista who had passed them a coffee. It sounds extraordinary, but once you dig deeper, it really shouldn't be extraordinary because of the sheer scale of what we as human beings shed. An average human sheds somewhere in the region of 50 million skin cells a day. One forensic legal scholar has calculated that in about 2 minutes, the average person sheds enough skin cells to cover a football pitch. We also leave saliva constantly. If you stand still and talk for 30 seconds, your DNA can end up more than a yard away from you. A normal sneeze can put it way further away. A Dutch research group once tested 105 ordinary public objects: escalator handrails, public toilet handles, the handles of shopping baskets, coins. 91% of them carried human DNA. Some carried the DNA of half a dozen different people. And here is the study that matters most for Lucas Anderson. Researchers have looked at how many of us, right now, are walking around with somebody else's DNA underneath our fingernails. The answer is about 1 in 5. 1 in 5. If you're listening to this episode with 4 other people around you, statistically, one of you is currently carrying a stranger's genetic material under your nails. Somebody you do not know and probably don't remember. Whether that transferred DNA actually turns up in a lab result depends on a handful of variables. How much there was, 2 cells are much harder to detect than 2000. How rigorous the contact was, a firm handshake moves more than a limp one. What the surfaces were made of, and how much time has passed, because foreign DNA does tend to rub off of you over the course of a day. And then there is the variable that I think is the strangest one of all, which is that some people just leave more genetic material than others. Forensic scientists call it shedder status. Good shedders put their DNA all over their environment. Poor shedders move through the world almost genetically invisible. Flaky, sweaty, or diseased skin sheds more than healthy dry skin. So do the hands of people who bite their nails, pick their noses, or touch their faces constantly. So do the hands that haven't been washed in a while. Now hold that thought against the specific facts of this case. Lucas Anderson was a homeless man with diabetes and a serious alcohol problem who had been living on the streets, who had been lying on a pavement for 2 hours, and who had just been physically wrestled onto a stretcher by paramedics. There is a case in England that shows how this can go the other way. In 2011, a cab driver from Liverpool called David Butler was charged with murder after DNA found under the fingernails of a woman killed 6 years earlier came back as a match to him. He said he had never met her. His defense pointed out that he had a skin condition so severe that other cab drivers nicknamed him Flaky and argued that he had probably given the real killer a lift and that the killer had picked up his skin cells in the cab and carried them to the victim. The investigators did not believe a word of it, but the jury did. He was acquitted after 8 months in custody. And then there is my favorite forensic disaster in modern history, which is the Phantom of Heilbronn. Between 1993 and 2009, German police hunted a serial offender whose DNA turned up at around 40 separate crime scenes across Germany, France, and Austria. Murders, a police officer shot dead, a robbery, a caravan burglary where the perpetrator had stopped to eat a biscuit. Police mobilized across 3 countries and offered an enormous award. They put in over 16,000 hours. The one thing they could never work out was that the pattern didn't match. The crimes had nothing in common with each other except the DNA. When they finally identified the Phantom of Heilbronn, she turned out to be an elderly Polish woman who worked in the factory that manufactured the cotton swabs the police were using to collect DNA. She had been contaminating the swabs. Police had then been using those swabs to contaminate 40 crime scenes with her. So this is a known problem. It's a documented, published, studied, embarrassing problem. And yet, in 2008, researchers at 3 American universities ran a series of studies on how jurors actually receive forensic evidence. They found that jurors rated DNA evidence as roughly 95% accurate and roughly 94% persuasive of guilt. Which brings us back to the interview room on Boxing Day and that sentence. In all the years I've been doing this, I've never seen a DNA hit be wrong. Kelly Cullick's reading of what happened to her client is not that anybody set out to frame him. Her reading is that traditional police work would have never led anyone to Lucas Anderson. The DNA led them to him first, and everything else was built around that story to make it fit. The old jail contact, the ankle monitor, the felony burglary of a really drunk man falling through a window. She called it confirmation bias. They got the DNA, she says, and then they made up the story to fit it. It's scary to think that if Lucas Anderson had not had that alibi, the prosecution would almost certainly have offered him a deal at some point. Plead to something lesser, take a fixed sentence, get the death penalty off the table. And a homeless man with no memory of the night, who had already told his own lawyer that maybe he did do it, would have been frightened enough to take it. If he had been a bit more sober, he'd have been on the street with nobody watching. And there would have been no record, and there would have been no alibi. His drinking is the thing that nearly killed him. His drinking is also the only thing that saved him. In May 2013, the district attorney's office dismissed the charges and Lucas Anderson walked out of Santa Clara County Jail after nearly 5 months inside, after which he went back to the streets where he continued to struggle with alcohol but stayed out of any serious trouble. Katrina Fritz, D'Angelo Austin's older sister, the woman who had known Raveesh Kumra since 1999, was initially charged with murder herself and was facing life without parole. Or worse, but she took a deal. In September 2014, she pleaded guilty to robbery and false imprisonment with gang enhancements in exchange for a maximum of 17 years and her testimony against all 3 men. She spent days on the stand, and this is where she gave all that testimony about Raveesh's private sex dealings. And I asked you to put an asterisk on, because this woman was saving her life by giving this account. She testified that she had started in sex work in Oakland at the age of 13 at her own mother's instruction, and that Raveesh Kumra had hired her at 19 and remained a client for over a decade. She testified about the trips and the cars and the money. She testified that her brother came to her shortly after Thanksgiving 2012 with a plan to rob the Kumras, that she tried to talk him out of it, but that then she gave him a detailed drawing of the layout of the house. She was released in 2017 after 4 years in custody. A man named Marcellus Drummer, nicknamed Blade, was arrested in March 2013 after police found a vintage Louis Vuitton handbag and an Indian-made gold bracelet at his home in Oakland. Phone records showed he had called Katrina Fritz minutes before the home invasion and had called D'Angelo Austin something in the region of 200 times in the 3 weeks around it. He was convicted in 2014 and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. D'Angelo Austin and Javier Garcia were tried together and convicted in June 2016. First-degree murder, robbery in concert, criminal threats, 2 accounts of false imprisonment. Austin was additionally convicted of assault with a deadly weapon. And here is a detail that I love in a really sad sort of way. Javier Garcia's defense at his trial was DNA transfer. His lawyer argued that Garcia's cousin was the one who had been involved, that the cousin had borrowed a box of gloves that Garcia regularly used, which was why Garcia's DNA was on the gloves in the sink, and that the cousin had borrowed Garcia's phone that night, which was why the phone pinged towers near Monte Sereno. The cousin died within weeks of the crime and was never questioned or investigated, but the jury did not buy it this time, not for a second. Garcia was sentenced to 25 years to life, consecutive to another 12 years. Austin was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, consecutive to a further 30 years to life, and 36 years and 4 months on other counts. But prosecutors continued to maintain that they thought more than 3 people entered the house that night, and that they'll keep hunting for whoever remained free. Rani Kumra came to all of those hearings. She sat in the courtroom with a dozen family members and friends. She had testified twice, once at Drummer's trial and then again at Austin and Garcia's. And one of the things she told the jury was that she still saw the face of the man who split her lip open. Every day, she said. Every night when there's a noise, she thinks it's him. Her victim statement talked about what Ravi had lost, that he would not be at his daughter's wedding, that he would never meet his grandchildren. But then she asked prosecutors not to seek the death penalty, not because of any doubt about guilt, because she did not believe in revenge, and because she believed in karma instead. Aaron Lunsford received commendations for his work on the Kumra case and was promoted to sergeant. He continued to maintain that this case fundamentally changed his view of DNA permanently. We shook hands, he now says, and I transferred onto you, and you transferred onto me. It happens. It's just biological. Kelly Kulick says the case changed something small but real in the way American courts work. Defense lawyers, she says, used to be laughed out of the room for arguing transfer in a closing argument. It was treated as hocus pocus, as invented nonsense. Lucas, she says, showed everyone that it's real. And Lucas, interestingly, was the only reason Raveesh got true justice in the real sense of the word. If you like what we do here at Desi Studios and absolutely love what we're wearing today, this is merch you can go buy all for yourself.
You can buy this Desi Crime merch in our YouTube store on the link down below at Karak Merch. Keep the engines at Desi Studios rolling so we can pay our videographer right behind the camera to make these amazing episodes just for you.